And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, including our ever-expanding Facebook page, over 32,000 followers strong now. It's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And today, after finally completing my coverage of the top 10 films of 1962, we immediately pivot to my list for 63. And once again, I'll be working my way up my list in reverse order of ranking. So without further ado, the best of 63 at the movies part 1, right now. And purely by coincidence, echoing my list for 62, where I had Dr. No at number 10, my 10th ranked film for 63 is also a James Bond film, in my opinion the best, at least of the 60s. With twice the budget of Dr. No at $2 million, and a corresponding quantum leap in production values, From Russia with Love, released in Britain in October of 63, but not in the US until the spring of 64, a few months after the assassination of JFK. I mention Kennedy only because Life magazine, in 1961, had famously listed Ian Fleming's novel, From Russia with Love, as one of JFK's top 10 favorite books, which led to a major boost in sales and media attention for the Fleming novels. Sadly, according to William Manchester, whose history of the Kennedy assassination, The Death of a President, was published in 1967, From Russia with Love was the last film that John F. Kennedy ever saw, in advance screening at the White House on November 20th, 1963. It was also, by the way, the last Bond film that Ian Fleming would see in completed form. He did visit the set of Goldfinger mid-shoot in April of 64, but he was in very bad shape, a heavy smoker and drinker for most of his life. Fleming died in August of 64, about a month before that film's British premiere, which was unfortunate in more ways than one, because 64 was really the year that the whole Bond phenomenon film-wise broke in a major way worldwide. Here in the US, From Russia with Love was the 5th highest grossing film of 64, and the follow-up, Goldfinger, was the 4th highest. 64, of course, was the year Beatlemania took hold here in the US as well, as the Beatles spearheaded the so-called British invasion. You could almost look at Bond as part of the film front of that invasion, as the movies certainly retain the British orientation established by Fleming. These novels were, in a sense, one of the last gasps, or after echoes really, of the British Empire mentality, an empire that, after 2 world wars, had really run out of steam by the time he started writing these novels in the early 50s. But getting back to 63, From Russia with Love, which I will call Russia from here on, the full title is a bit cumbersome. So Russia retained many of the key players from Dr. No on both sides of the camera. Of course, Sean Connery, now 32, played 007 once again, director Terrence Young was back, editor Peter Hunt, composer-arranger John Barry, although in a more prominent role. On Dr. No, Barry's only contribution, for which he did not receive credit, was the arrangement of Monty Norman's Bond theme, and Norman did the background scoring for that film as well. But Barry composed all the music for this one, except the theme song, which I'll get to later, and he would do so for 10 more Bond films after this. So Russia commenced filming on April 1st, 1963, at Pinewood Studios, 20 miles outside of London, where much of the film was shot, although there were multiple foreign locations used as well, primarily Istanbul, but also Venice and Switzerland. There was a law in the UK at that time that in order to qualify for British funding, 70% of a film had to be shot in Britain or the British Commonwealth. So most of the interiors and some of the exteriors, including the pre-credit sequence as well as the gypsy camp sequence with the girl fight that's interrupted by a gun battle, those were shot at Pinewood as well. And when cameras started rolling on April 1st, the first scene shot was the one where M, the Secret Service chief played by another returning regular, Bernard Lee, briefs 007 on the perils and potential pleasures of his new mission. which involves romancing a beautiful Russian cipher clerk, Tatiana Romanova, played by Daniela Bianchi, a former Miss Universe contestant whose voice was completely dubbed here to replace the Italian accent with a Russian one. Tatiana, stationed in Istanbul, has delivered a message to the British Secret Service through their Turkish colleagues that she will provide them with a Soviet Lecter decoding machine on the condition that she can hand-deliver it to Bond, on whom she claims to have a schoolgirl crush, and then defect to Britain. This mission briefing scene, by the way, introduces us for the first time to the man known as Q, played by Welsh actor Desmond Llewellyn, another regular, who in film after film provides Bond with seemingly superfluous but ultimately extremely useful deadly gadgets. This one is fairly modest, by later Bond standards, a briefcase that detonates a tear gas bomb if improperly opened. But this scene, originally intended to be the first in the film, turned out not to be, as Russia inaugurated another Bond tradition, the attention-grabbing pre-credit sequence, which in later films would be mostly irrelevant to the primary plot. Not so with this one. It introduces one of the major villains of the film, Grant the Assassin, portrayed by Robert Shaw, who, for reasons unclear to me, followed in Robert Duvall's footsteps in To Kill a Mockingbird and dyed his hair blonde for this film. But this pre-credit sequence was the brainchild of Harry Saltzman, who co-produced these films with Albert Broccoli. Terrence Young, who would direct one more Bond film after this one, Thunderball, later said that Saltzman was equally capable of coming up with brilliant or terrible ideas, sometimes in the same breath. So one of Young's tasks was to convince Saltzman that the brilliant ideas were brilliant and the terrible ones terrible. The latter often took some doing. But Saltzman's latest brainwave was that Bond, early in the second film, should be quote-unquote killed, which became a semi-regular tradition in the series. At the beginning of Thunderball, for example, you see the initials JB on a shroud draped over a coffin, which, lo and behold, turns out to be someone else's initials. And then in the next film, You Only Live Twice, there's a more elaborate fake death in a bullet-riddled Hong Kong bed, and then a subsequent burial at sea. But Saltzman, and I'm just speculating here, could have derived this idea from Ian Fleming, who in 1956, after writing 5 Bond novels in 4 years, had grown a little tired of 007. In a letter to a friend, he wrote of his, quote, waning enthusiasm for this cardboard booby, unquote, and that he was afraid the whole project had grown stale. So Fleming, at that point, was toying with the idea of outright killing Bond at the end of From Russia with Love. But still undecided, he left his options open with a cliffhanger. So the novel, which, along with Casino Royale, the first, is probably the best of the handful that I've read. Like the film, it ends with a vicious altercation between Bond and the witch-like Rosa Klebb, played in the film by Lotte Lenya, who I'll get to. That masterful bit of casting was another Saltzman brainwave. Klebb is armed, or maybe footed would be more precise, with a poison-tipped switchblade in the toe cap of her right boot, allegedly a real weapon of the KGB, which we do see in the film more than once. In the book, she also wields poison-tipped knitting needles, which unfortunately we do not see. But in the novel, unlike the film, Klebb does connect with a kick to the shins, and just as the poison begins to kick in, the novel abruptly ends after the following sentence. Bond pivoted slowly on his heel and crashed headlong to the wine-red floor. Ultimately, of course, Fleming had a change of heart, and in Dr. No, the follow-up novel, Fleming informs us, without providing any details, that Klebb is dead, and that Bond survived the poison, which, he informs us, quote, comes from the sex organs of the Japanese globefish, unquote. That's Fleming in a nutshell right there. Sex and death with a touch of the international. But whatever the inspiration, Saltzman very much wanted to kill Bond in this film at some point, preferably early. So Richard Maybaum, the veteran Hollywood screenwriter who was one of several people to labor on this script, at Saltzman's request, Maybaum wrote a pre-credit sequence set at a kind of training camp for Spectre, a fictional kind of destabilizing third force in the Cold War that seeks to play the West and the Communist bloc against each other. A dynamic cleverly illustrated in this film by the head of Spectre, Blofeld, who directs the attention of 2 of his lieutenants to a fish tank, where a pair of Siamese fighting fish, representing East and West, are busy killing each other, while a third fish bides its time behind a partition, waiting for the chance to kill the exhausted victor. That's a change, by the way, made by the filmmakers. Fleming had not yet introduced Spectre in either of the first two novels filmed, Dr. No or From Russia with Love, but Spectre is the primary adversary in both films. In the early novels, including the two I just mentioned, the enemy is Smersh, a fictionalized version of a real Soviet entity, a kind of umbrella organization for three counterintelligence agencies in the Red Army. The name Smersh, a blending of Russian words meaning death to spies, was invented by Joseph Stalin, who was still very much alive when Fleming began the series. So the clear adversary in the early novels is the Soviet Union. But in the ninth book of the series, Thunderball, published at the start of the Kennedy administration in 1961, Fleming decided to replace Smersh with this non-ideological third force, Spectre. The reason for this, from what I've gathered, is that Fleming felt at this time, 60-61, that there was a thaw underway in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And there was some evidence of this. There was the nuclear testing moratorium that had started in 1958 with Khrushchev in charge, and Khrushchev, while no angel certainly, was clearly no Stalin either. And his U.S. tour in September of '59 had gone remarkably well, despite a few minor hitches. And his meetings with Eisenhower during that tour were also fairly positive. As it turned out, Fleming jumped the gun. Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union increased to perhaps their most dangerous level ever during the Kennedy years, with the Berlin crisis followed by the resumption of testing, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, and beyond that was the ever-increasing threat of Communist China, with that country joining the nuclear club in 1964. But in 1960, when he was writing Thunderball, none of that had happened yet, and so Fleming decided to back off to a large extent from ideology in the Bond novels. And this decision was adopted by the Bond film producers as well, who retained some of the novel's anti-communist flavor certainly, but presented Spectre as the primary enemy from the get-go, which required a bit of reshuffling of the plots by Maybaum of both Dr. No and From Russia with Love. But getting back to this pre-credit sequence, a man, apparently James Bond, clearly played by Sean Connery, is being stalked through a large maze-like Renaissance garden by Robert Shaw, the Spectre assassin, who finally strangles Connery with a garrote that extends out from his wristwatch, a device shamelessly lifted by Brian De Palma for Blowout, perhaps his best film, where the assassin is played by John Lithgow. Here, as it turns out, the strangled man is actually a test victim, which we learn when the Bond mask is pulled from a different actor's mustached face before the opening credit music kicks in. And this pre-credit sequence is the first of many scenes in this film, where Terence Young deliberately refers to other contemporary films, which makes From Russia with Love a lot of fun for cinephiles. The garden, for example, was deliberately modeled on a similar one in a very polarizing French film released 2 years earlier, Last Year at Marienbad. Polarizing because the film was deliberately confusing, with a number of incompatible elements that make the film's chronology and the events themselves highly ambiguous. Further muddying the waters was the fact that the director, Alain Resnais, and the screenwriter, Alain Robbe-Grillet, provided contradictory explanations of the film after it was released. So some critics called it the best film ever made, while others, including Pauline Kael, not yet installed at the New Yorker magazine and really at the height of her kind of raging prophet in the wilderness phase, dismissed it completely. Pauline Kael called it, quote, "the snow job at the Ice Palace, a no-fun party for non-people," unquote. But much of that no-fun party, as she calls it, takes place in a vast geometric garden at a luxury hotel. So Terence Young, who was more in the Kael camp as far as Marienbad was concerned, he thought it was pretentious, kind of aped that setting for this considerably more fun sequence. Now, the idea of a Spectre training camp was another Harry Saltzman light bulb inspired by Spartacus, released in 1960. If you remember, early in that film, Kirk Douglas and the other gladiators developed their deadly skills at a kind of training camp. And so early in this film, we return to the setting of that pre-credit sequence and observe Spectre operatives getting their blowtorch practice in. And this is another new element in this film that would become a staple, but in altered form, as in later films, the increasingly elaborate training exercises are performed not by the bad guys, but by the British Secret Service. But looking at film references beyond Marienbad and Spartacus, it's really Alfred Hitchcock's films, especially North by Northwest, that are evoked in this film the most often. Actually, the idea for the novel itself could have been derived from Notorious, one of Hitchcock's very best films. The concept of using sex as a tactic to infiltrate the enemy camp is central to that film, where Ingrid Bergman, playing the daughter of a convicted Nazi war criminal, takes on the assignment of seducing Claude Rains as part of an American espionage operation against a group of former Nazis in Brazil who are seeking to acquire atomic weapons. Cary Grant plays her American handler, who, oddly enough, has a British accent, as does the ostensibly German Claude Rains. Hitchcock, for whom plausibility was never a major priority, actually gave Rains the choice of doing the part with a German or British accent, and Rains chose the latter, which frankly I prefer to a fake accent. But whereas Bergman is faking her interest in Rains, she's in love with Grant. In this film, Tatiana is herself seduced by the man she's been assigned to seduce, Bond, which makes for an intriguing dynamic. But certainly that Mata Hari concept is central to both films. Of course, Hitchcock didn't exactly invent that concept, nor did Mata Hari. It goes back at least as far as the Bible, where Delilah seduces Samson at the behest of the Philistines. Now, another Hitchcock element we see in this film is the use of exotic locations. Countless Hitchcock films, The Man Who Knew Too Much, where Doris Day and Jimmy Stewart are traveling from Casablanca to Marrakesh when their son is kidnapped. North by Northwest is kind of an American tour by train that ends up at Mount Rushmore. Hitchcock's original title for that film was The Man in Lincoln's Nose. But he used such locations to create a sense of eye-catching adventure. Ironically, Hitchcock, the ultimate control freak, hated shooting on location, especially later in his career, as actual locations are unpredictable, and Istanbul certainly presented problems for Terence Young, especially the outdoor street scenes. It was not a city where a great many major motion pictures had been filmed. So for the locals, this was a big event, and huge crowds would gather to watch the filming. And of course, many of the people in those crowds would look directly into the camera lens, ruining the shot. So for one critical wide shot of an outdoor scene where Bond is boarding a train, Young actually fabricated a diversion. He had one of his stuntmen go to a nearby apartment building, dangle from a window, and scream his head off, which drew the police and fire engines. And so the crowd, perhaps thinking this was part of the film, rushed over there, and Young got his wide shot. But Richard Maybaum wrote a number of scenes for this film that are not derived from the novel, just to give this extremely picturesque city more exposure. The mosques, the underground cisterns, the Bosporus waterway, all these local landmarks make it into the film. So like many Hitchcock and other Bond films, From Russia with Love serves as a kind of travelogue as well. And as I mentioned, when it's time for Bond to leave Istanbul with Tatiana and the decoding machine in his possession, he does so on one of the great old trains of Europe, the Orient Express, which still connected Istanbul and Paris at that time. And on the train, we get the long-awaited brutal fight to the death between Connery and Shaw, for which the two men did not use stunt doubles. And train scenes, by the way, that's another Hitchcock specialty, going way back to the 1930s. The 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes, almost all of which takes place on a train, right up to Strangers on a Train, and of course North by Northwest. Now, one key figure behind the camera who was not retained from Dr. No was set designer Ken Adam. He had been poached away by Stanley Kubrick, who had been impressed by Adam's work on Dr. No and hired him for Dr. Strangelove, for which Adam created that famous War Room set. He would return to the Bond fold for Goldfinger and many others. He also reunited with Kubrick in the mid-70s for the criminally undervalued Barry Lyndon, for which Adam won an Academy Award. But his replacement on Russia, Sid Cain, did a great job, first of all, recreating the Orient Express. But his most elaborate and beautiful set appears early in the film. It's an enormous chess room that cost $150,000. The ceiling is actually a matte painting, which they used to hide the lighting for the wide shots. Like most sets, it was lit from the top. But the fact that the ceiling is a painting is not apparent to the naked eye. It's really good. The purpose of this chess scene, by the way, is to introduce Czechoslovakian Spectre agent Kronstein, who has a side gig as a chess grandmaster. So Kronstein, after receiving word during this match that his presence is requested immediately at a Spectre conference with Blofeld and Rosa Klebb, quickly finishes off his opponent and heads off to Blofeld's floating headquarters on his yacht to finalize the master plan to annihilate Bond. And another strength of this film is the casting in small roles like this. Terence Young later said that one of the challenges when you're casting a supporting character who only makes 2 or 3 brief appearances but is critical to the plot is reminding the audience who they are when they reappear. So for Kronstein, Young was looking for a very distinctive, kind of angular Slavic face. And he found that face on Polish actor Władek Szabał, mostly known at that time for his role in Kanał, the second of Polish director Andrzej Wajda's trilogy of war films released in the 50s. Kanał covers the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, which resulted in the almost total destruction of that city by the Nazis. Szabał himself had actually worked with the Polish resistance during World War II as a teenager, and he had been imprisoned by the Nazis twice, escaping both times. Now, when he read the script for this film, his initial reaction was that it was idiotic. But, just by coincidence, Szabał happened to be good friends with Sean Connery's then wife, Australian actress Diane Cilento, and she talked Szabał into playing Kronstein. And as with most actors who played memorable bit parts in these Bond films, it would ultimately be his most remembered performance. And whatever misgivings he may have had about the script, the film certainly helped him find additional work, albeit in a similar vein. Actually, Szabał shows up in the 1967 Bond spoof, Casino Royale, as one of Orson Welles' operatives. But perhaps the most direct Hitchcock reference comes when Connery, after his hard-fought victory over Shaw, leaves the train with Tatiana in Yugoslavia. Of course, many of these countries no longer exist, where 2 Spectre agents greet him with an attack by helicopter, a sequence that clearly refers to the crop duster sequence in North by Northwest, where Cary Grant is attacked from the skies. By the way, Hitchcock himself was a fan of 007. Which, you could almost regard North by Northwest as a kind of unofficial template for the Bond films. And Saltzman and Broccoli, with that film in mind, had briefly considered offering Cary Grant the Bond role in Dr. No. But they soon realized that given Grant's age, which was 58 at that time, they would only have to replace him in short order and start from scratch. They were thinking series from the get-go. And Connery worked out very well. It's a funny thing, Connery, despite reports to the contrary, did enjoy doing the Bond films, and he certainly enjoyed the money. But he did have concerns from the outset about being typecast. Remember, when Dr. No was released, he was basically a complete unknown. So after Dr. No succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and the producers offered Connery a multi-picture deal for the Bond series, he said, sure, I'll sign on long term, but you're going to have to let me do other films as well. And when they asked him, what other films do you want to do? He said, almost off the top of his head, I'd love to work with Alfred Hitchcock. So Albert Broccoli, on his own, called Hitchcock, who said, sure, I'd be delighted to use him, and did so on Marnie, which was shot between Russia and Goldfinger. What's funny, given Connery's concerns about being typecast, is that his performance in Marnie is virtually indistinguishable from Bond. He's not a secret agent. He's a wealthy widower who owns a publishing firm, but same devilish charm, same crafty intelligence, same kind of masculine assertiveness bordering on arrogance. Now, unfortunately, Marnie was a disaster in every respect. You'll find starry-eyed revisionists who claim it's actually a masterpiece. They'll find all kinds of hidden subtexts, which I'm sure would have confounded Hitchcock, that tell you nothing about the film and everything about their own preoccupations. I just saw Marnie. It's flat out terrible. and the brilliant shot here and there, or the good, if somewhat self-plagiarizing score by Bernard Herrmann. He kind of recycled the Vertigo score for Marnie. Nothing can mask the ludicrous psychobabble in that screenplay. In fact, those positive surface elements actually accentuate it. And after the justifiable critical pounding that Marnie received, Hitchcock managed to follow up with an even bigger disaster, Torn Curtain. But honestly, these late career blunders are easy to forgive when you consider, how many renowned directors are there who produced just one or maybe two masterpieces. And this guy produced how many? 7, 8? So his legacy is more than secure. But the truth is, even though Terence Young was a great admirer of Hitchcock, his approach to directing was almost the polar opposite. Hitchcock, as you probably know, worked out everything in advance. He storyboarded every shot and said more than once that he found the actual shooting of his films fairly tedious because the truly creative work, in his opinion, had already been done. Not an actor's director, to put it mildly. He basically saw actors not so much as people, but as elements in his overall visual scheme. I mean, one of several reasons why Torn Curtain was such a miserable production was Hitchcock kept wanting Paul Newman to be Cary Grant, who basically directed himself, and Newman kept wanting Hitchcock to be, Elia Kazan. Kazan was happy to talk about psychology and character and motivation with his actors for hours. So Newman kept asking Hitchcock, what's my motivation here? And Hitchcock kept saying, your motivation is your salary, But Hitchcock did not delegate, at least not the tasks he could do himself, which were many. Whereas Terence Young was more than happy to delegate and did so. He would basically just cover the action. For example, in the scene I just mentioned, he shot the helicopter from multiple angles. He shot Connery running for his life from multiple angles with no real sense of how these shots would be ordered. And then he let his editor, Peter Hunt, stitch it all together, which was a huge job. But one of the nice things about the budget for this film being double that of Dr. No is they could afford to do additional shooting if they wanted to. So for a number of scenes, for example, the fight aboard the Orient Express, Hunt put together an initial edit, and then he showed it to Young and said what would really add to this scene would be, a close-up shot of the window breaking, a close-up of the garrote starting to slice into Connery's neck. So Young would go back and get those shots, a new edit would be created, and so on. So very much a partnership. But looked at side by side, the difference between Hitchcock's crop duster sequence and the helicopter attack in this film is, to me, the difference between a master craftsman and a competent professional. The controlled tempo, the incremental accumulation of suspense that Hitchcock manages to create in that Indiana cornfield, the audacious absurdity of the attack itself, aided immeasurably by Cary Grant's facial expressions. He was a genius. I mean, in its own way, it's as incredible a set piece as the shower scene in Psycho. Whereas the helicopter attack here is crudely effective, but there's nothing especially artful about it. It's just a collection of shots. In fact, I would say all the violent scenes in this film, with the exception of the train fight, that's very good. But the attack on the gypsy camp, this helicopter assault, and then the speedboat chase in the Gulf of Venice are, in my opinion, the dullest scenes in the picture, especially given the fact that Bond will survive. But to me, what lifts this above the other Bond films is the supporting acting. Robert Shaw, probably most remembered today for his portrayal of Quint in Jaws, was by 1963 already a veteran theater actor, mostly Shakespeare, and a published novelist and playwright as well. He and Sean Connery shared the same agent and had a kind of friendly rivalry. And both actors, with masculine charisma to spare, seem worthy adversaries in this film. Although Grant, the Shaw character, plays a much larger role in the book. Fleming, as an experiment, decided to omit Bond more or less entirely from the first third of the novel. So we start with Grant and get his entire backstory, descriptions of his various murders, and how he came to be employed by the Soviets, none of which is in the film. So while the Grant role is certainly not one of Shaw's greatest, he does make the most of it, and is genuinely threatening. And it certainly gave his film career a boost, although he continued to work on stage at least as much, and also continued to write. In fact, one of his plays, The Man in the Glass Booth, a fictionalized version of the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann, was made into a pretty good film in 1975, with Maximilian Schell giving an Oscar-nominated performance in the lead role. But to me, the crown jewel of the supporting cast in this film is Lotte Lenya as Rosa Klebb, who manages to be both sinister and laugh-out-loud funny at the same time. Lenya, 64 when this was filmed, had put her name on the map back in 1928 in pre-Hitler Germany with her portrayal of Jenny in The Threepenny Opera, a play by Bertolt Brecht, for which Lenya's husband, Kurt Weill, had composed the music. She's also in the 1931 film. And after Weill's death in 1950, she continued to perform his work all over the world, a legendary stage presence, and as it turned out, screen presence as well. She was nominated for an Oscar in 1962 for her role as the manager of a stable of gigolos in The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, not a film I can recommend. Lenya was beaten out by Rita Moreno for West Side Story. But one thing you may not fully realize watching this film is Lotte Lenya was a fairly tiny woman, maybe 5'5" and about 100 pounds. And so Terence Young, concerned that she wouldn't appear threatening enough as this fearsome Spectre agent, had initially instructed the costume designers to pad her clothes. But she said, no, hold the padding. I can play this part so I don't appear weak or small. And she does. I mean, the truth is, with film, it's pretty easy to fool audiences about an actor's size. I mean, think about how threatening Al Pacino is in, Godfather 2 or Scarface. I've seen him on the street more than once. No disrespect, huge talent, not a huge man, tiny, in fact, like you can barely see him. Actually, Robert Shaw, who was not a short man at 5'10", was still 4 inches shorter than Sean Connery. But again, you wouldn't necessarily know that watching their scenes together. But as with Wladek Szabal as Kronstein, Lotte Lenya always said that out of her whole career, this performance was the one best remembered, which, if true, is a little sad, given her excellent stage work. But there's a marvelous touch of the absurd when she starts kicking away with that protruding boot blade. On the one hand, it's threatening because you've been informed that it's poison-tipped. On the other hand, she looks comically uncoordinated, and part of that was due to the fact that her costume included these super thick Coke bottle glasses. Daniela Bianchi, who plays Tatiana, she later said that in between takes of their scene together, they were convulsed with laughter because, well, first of all, the Rosa Klebb character in no way resembled the real Lotte Lenya, who, according to everyone who ever crossed her path, was an uncommonly sweet person, but also because she couldn't see a thing through these thick glasses. But I've said this before, obviously screenwriting, direction, lead acting, photography. These are the primary building blocks in making a good film. But the two elements on top of that can really lift a film into greatness, or in this case, greatness within the strict limitations of the genre, are excellent supporting acting and a really good musical score. And this film has both. And not just the background score, but the theme song as well. The first, actually, of many Bond theme songs. Dr. No did not have one. And as I said, it was not written by John Barry, but by Lionel Bart, who became famous as the sole creator of the 1960 hit musical Oliver. Unlike later Bond theme songs, starting with the very next one, Goldfinger, the vocal version of the song From Russia with Love is only heard over the end titles, which was a big disappointment initially to the singer Matt Monro, but it turned out to be a huge hit for him, and it's super catchy. As for the other background music, Barry had initially planned to heavily incorporate Turkish music, and he actually traveled to Istanbul on his own to record local music. But in the end, he decided to use just standard Western orchestration with occasional Turkish touches, finger cymbals, some other exotic percussion like that for color, which works really well. And I also want to give a shout out to Robert Brownjohn, who created the distinctive opening titles. Brownjohn projected the film's credits on various body parts of an undulating belly dancer. His primary source of inspiration for this was the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, a famous Hungarian artist who in the 1920s and 30s had experimented with projecting light onto various interesting surfaces: smoke, vapor, artificial clouds. Very creative guy. The biggest problem for Brownjohn, technically, was keeping the titles in focus, as they used a long lens with correspondingly shallow depth of field. So the belly dancer, Lisa Guiraud, who shows up again in the gypsy camp scene, and also, by the way, appears briefly in the opening yacht party scene of Days of Wine and Roses, she had to really toe the mark for these titles, which was a little unnatural, but they pulled it off. I mean, now they would do it digitally, but back then they used an actual light projector. But great opening titles, and totally consistent with the bold suggestiveness of the film, the screenplay of which ups the ante considerably over Dr. No as far as sexual double entendres, which get a little forced in later films, but are mostly amusing here. So, in the final analysis, what is this film's underlying message? What's it really about? Not a blessed thing, but it doesn't pretend to be. It simply seeks to entertain, and it certainly achieves that goal. And what's nice about these early Bond films, the first three, I would say, the filmmakers weren't as hemmed in by audience expectations. They were still trying out new stuff and seeing what worked, so there's a kind of freshness to it. The later ones feel like the filmmakers are not so much entertaining as servicing the audience, like obediently checking off all the boxes. Here's your pre-credit sequence, here's a few gadgets, here's your Bond girl with a ludicrous name, here's an explosion, here's another. So by the late 60s, early 70s, to me at least, a kind of formulaic staleness sets in, and totally gone is any relationship to the realities of espionage, to which they at least pay some lip service in these early films. I mean, if you want the real deal on Cold War espionage, I would urge you to read John le Carré, or see the films based on his novels, the best of which is The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. He wrote beautifully, if depressingly for the most part, from personal experience. But I'm not here to rain on the Bond parade. Escapist fantasy has its place, certainly. And fun is an important part of life. So if you're up for some good early Bond, check out From Russia with Love, my 10th ranked film of 1963, for its cleverly complex but not overly confusing plot that generally steers clear of the cartoonishness of the later films, for the seductive interplay between Connery and the lovely Daniela Bianchi, a much more recognizably human Bond girl than the others. My favorite, actually, for that reason. For the exotic locations, for the toe-tapping music, and above all, for the icing on the cake, some really juicy supporting performances, especially the little lady with the flaming red hair, Coke bottle glasses, and poisoned boot blade, the great Lotte Lenya. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.